Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well here today. Doing a little bit of gemcraft in the background as well. I'm just playing some of my video games while I'm at it. But that'll be stopping very shortly as we have a book to read. And I think I do recall where we last left off. So, without further ado, let's do it. By pausing that first and foremost. So, one more thing before I start. Some people were noticing that I was very tired in the last video or two I've done. That's mainly because I've only had 5 hours of sleep each of the last 5 bloody days. So that's why I've been, yawning like a maniac, as proven here. But I could safely say I went to bed about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I practically went to bed as soon as I got home. So I've literally been asleep for like 15 hours. So hopefully that'll compensate for the other 15 or so that I've missed. Anyway, let's get that out of the way and let's read the book. So, considering the history of periodic outrage in Canada about their oligarchy sheltering Ukrainian National Socialists, you're expected to believe that 338 democratic elitists, the puppets in the Canadian Parliament, knew nothing of this history. It wasn't just Zelensky and the Speaker of the Parliament implicated in this scandal. Canada's opposition Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, I believe I've pronounced that right, said Prime Minister Trudeau was also responsible for the incident. Mr. Trudeau's office also denied allegations that a private meeting took place between Mr. Juncker and the Prime Minister. Trudeau would say that, though. He would say that, wouldn't he? Notice how the BBC puts that detail in the story, though, just in case evidence later should have... Stroke number 1. We're only 60 seconds in reading this book. Just in case evidence should later emerge that Trudeau was lying about this meeting not taking place. This is the same Trudeau government that used the iron heel to crush protests by Canadian truckers, condemning the truckers for Nazi symbolism, when in fact, as even the BBC admitted, the truckers were comparing the brutal repression of Trudeau's Liberal government to how the National Socialists treated Jews. The BBC report on the protest says, and I quote, Nazi symbolism was seen on protest signs, some likening COVID-19 health measures to Jews under Nazi persecution. Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies criticized the use of those symbols as a heinous form of Holocaust distortion. Mr. Trudeau said, freedom of expression, assembly, and association are cornerstones of democracy, but Nazi symbolism, racist imagery, and desecration of war memorials are not. The Prime Minister refused to meet protesters. End quote. So Trudeau would not meet Canadians who were not National Socialists, but when it came to honouring Jewish Zelensky, Trudeau's government and the entire Canadian Parliament gave 2 standing ovations to a man who had been an actual SS officer. The Canadians protesting against medical procedures were aware that the oligarchy narrative in relation to medical procedures that kill millions of healthy babies is, it's my body, it's my choice. Yet that principle doesn't apply when it inconveniences the oligarchy. When it suits the oligarchy, you have no bodily autonomy. You are just a farmed animal that is not allowed to object to forced medical procedures. Women who seek to end the life of their baby are brave, but common people who refuse untested medical procedures are Nazis. It's worth quoting at length other details by those immersed in Canadian politics. It's not the first time the Trudeau government has supported Nazism, Ezra Levant noted. Last year, Deputy PM of Canada and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, held up a scarf promoting far-right Ukrainian nationalist movements linked to neo-Nazis commemorating Stefan Bandera, the Nazi criminal. Freeland deleted her social media posts, but not before the photo was saved. Freeland's office not only rushed to take down the photo from the minister's website, but maintained Freeland had been a victim of Russian disinformation. Freeland's grandfather worked as a Nazi propagandist, a fact she denied for years. Levant also noted Google has 738 1,000 hits for Trucker Convoy Nazi, all stories from one fake photograph of an agent provocateur with a swastika flag that no one else saw. 738,000 hits. Emphasis added. You see how the oligarchy works. Massive coverage for the narrative they want to get in the gramophone mind. Minimal coverage for the truth. Other Canadian journalists claim that Canada's deputy PM knew her grandfather was a propagandist for Hitler's National Socialists. You can tell those 15 hours have done me a load of good, haven't you? Anyway, is it any wonder that the pretend liberal democracy of Canada would support National Socialism in Ukraine? Would knowingly fund and train Ukrainian soldiers wearing National Socialist insignia, would invite a former Waffen-SS to the parliament and give him 2 standing ovations in front of Zelensky. Do you really think that the political parties and the Secret Service in Canada don't know the stroke number 2, the background of the Prime Minister? Of the Deputy PM's family, sorry, not the Prime Minister. Sorry, that's what happens when you have a stroke. Everything gets distorted. Do you really think they do not investigate the past of someone invited to Parliament to be honoured there? In June 2024, when Tommy Robinson arrived in Canada, he was interviewed by immigration officials for 3 hours, and then a few days later was arrested in Canada on immigration matters, held for some hours and then released. He wasn't being invited to the Canadian Parliament to be showered with honours, so he was interrogated on arrival in Canada and arrested and interrogated under terrorism laws later when leaving the UK. But a former SS officer invited to the Canadian Parliament to be honoured was not investigated at all? Only gullible sheep would believe this. People such as Tommy Robinson with a history of denouncing National Socialism are branded far right, while the transgender promoting protest-crushing Nazi-training Trudeau government gets a free pass. The virtue signalling is designed to distract you from their political crimes, point out the truth about the oligarchy, and you are accused of promoting Russian disinformation, of being Islamophobic, and of being far right. Do you think, given the history of Canada commemorating the Ukrainian SS, that when the Deputy PM of Canada was in Kiev holding up a flag commemorating Ukrainian National Socialists, that it was something she did unknowingly? Freeland has degrees from Harvard and Oxford University. She worked as a journalist in Ukraine, and even her Wikipedia page claims that her grandfather was a propagandist for National Socialism in Ukraine, and that her political career was funded by Ukrainians. Aren't these elitists supposed to be smarter and better educated than the rest of us? How do we explain that some journalists were prepared to expose the hypocrisy of Canada's Liberal Democratic government when it comes down to giving the last surviving SS officers multiple standing ovations? Some of these journalists must have been conflicted. They've been living in a period of 80 years in which National Socialists were the devil, the incarnation of evil, yet here was the poster boy for demented liberalism centre stage and applauding the SS. In this situation, it's clear some journalists had to go against the oligarchy and stick to the well-habituated narrative of National Socialism is the devil. The cover-up narrative is simple. Politician made mistake, politician resigns, some punishment. Everything is once again peachy. It's clear that most journalists were prepared to cover up the oligarchy's support for Ukrainian National Socialism in Canada as soon as the speaker resigned, and Trudeau professed, "I knew nothing. It was an honest mistake, Governor." Consider for how many years you heard the oligarchy's minions about the Trump-Russia dossier, funded and faked by the Democratic Party, in air quotes. Consider how much defamation you hear about Tommy Robinson. Consider all the reporting that Giorgia Meloni, being Prime Minister of Italy, was the return of fascism to Italy. And now consider how little you've heard about Canada importing thousands of Ukrainian National Socialists, building monuments to them, promoting their offspring to senior positions in the Canadian Parliament, and consider how quickly the story of the Canadian Parliament applauding the Waffen-SS was buried. and how your news media told you nothing of the military in Canada training Ukrainian National Socialist soldiers there in the years leading up to this standing ovation to the Waffen SS. Since the oligarchy will applaud the SS but pretend it was a mistake, since they fund, arm and train modern-day avowed National Socialists from Ukraine, only a fool would believe any part of the official narrative about the conflict in Ukraine. The oligarchy already has soldiers from NATO in Ukraine, undoubtedly operating the endless stream of weapons that this defensive alliance has sent to Ukraine in a war the West provoked. Weapons, training, and funds all being provided with the consent of the electorates of liberal democracies who have, if they believe they live under democracy, chosen to initiate World War III. We should all be profoundly grateful that the leadership in Russia can see the masses in liberal democracies are not in control, but it is the oligarchy who are to be held responsible for starting World War III. Whether those soldiers are in the Ukraine as mercenaries, on temporary leave from their posts in NATO armies, or whether they are there as military advisors is also irrelevant. Whether Putin is just playing his part with the oligarchy in the West, both sides bringing about World War III, is a moot point. Russia is also run by an oligarchy, just as Britain, Germany, and Ukraine are, and they may all want World War III to distract the masses from, well, basically distract them as the money bubble implodes. The oligarchy have no principles and will happily sacrifice millions in wars that serve the larger strategic aims of the oligarchy, adding to their power and their riches. Putin and Russia have been turned into figures of irrational hatred in the West, with Russians banned from supposedly non-political events such as the Olympic Games and Eurovision, with the organised liberal fascists of the West banning vodka, and even long-dead Russian composers and authors. After every Islamic terrorist attack, we are told you can't blame all Muslims, but apparently we are to blame all Russians unless those Russians condemn Russia. But no one asks Muslims to condemn Islam and the Quran, saying only after his condemnation of Islam's commands to kill will you individual Muslims be exempt from blame. The double standards of the oligarchy expose that they have no principles. Conscription will start across Europe in those countries that don't already have it. It's been announced that Denmark is to start stroke number 3, conscripting women, clearly not what the feminists wanted when they started to demand equality. A couple of years later, some significant event will happen. Perhaps the ZNPP, or, oh god, I'm going to butcher this fucking word, let me tell you, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power station in Europe, will explode due to Ukraine NATO actions, just like the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were attacked by Ukraine's allies in NATO. Even now, when the nuclear power station is guarded and protected by Russia, there are frequent attempts to blow it up by Ukraine and NATO, with the oligarchy in the West pretending that Russia might be trying to blow up this nuclear facility when it is Russian troops guarding it. Russian authorities accuse the Ukrainian military of carrying out a series of attacks against the plant using self-exploding drones. According to a statement posted on ZNPP's official Telegram channel, full stop there. But Ukrainian officials denied responsibility and accused Russia of endangering the nuclear facility and surrounding population. Since Ukraine NATO blew up the massive Nord Stream pipelines and no one in the West cares, of course the oligarchy will be prepared to blow up the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. The public will just get back to binge-watching whatever distractions the oligarchy serves up on the hundreds of distraction channels under the control of the oligarchy. Well, I don't have Freeview or whatever, so that doesn't distract me. I just play video games, although you could say that's a distraction. Anyway, back to what we were talking about. When the disaster occurs that triggers the declaration of World War III, the mad tyrant Putin will be blamed. Obviously, mad tyrant Putin in air quotes. Not the oligarchy of the West and their Nazi puppets in Ukraine. And the young citizens of the West and their Nazi puppets of the West will be marched into war. I'm sorry, I really should be focused on this. Because of that massive act of terrorism against Russian and German piped gas infrastructure, which provided cheap gas to Europe, even throughout the Cold War, Russia was supplying cheap natural gas to Europe. Germany's economy is now starved of energy. Meanwhile, the USA economy gets a boost because Europe is now dependent on expensive LNG being shipped into containers from the USA instead of cheap piped gas from Russia. Years ago, we saw people predict the USA will never allow Nord Stream 2 to go online, and that prediction came to pass. The oligarchy in the West sanctioned Russian businesses, meaning that it became impossible to pay Russia for commodities it sells. Then the oligarchy in the West tell the gullible sheep Russia has cut off gas supplies to Europe. The dishonesty and deceit are breathtaking. Now, this is actually something I did not know about. Mind you, I never really read into it, as I guess I was distracted by my gaming. But now to learn that basically the oligarchy is responsible for Nord Stream 2 not going online. Christ. Anyway, people in Europe are going to get colder and get poorer as energy costs rise and productions fall. Except for war production. EU aims to shift European arms industry to war economy mode, but the free slaves cannot see in what direction they are being herded. When these points have been made to ordinary people, those who will vote Labour or will vote Con-Socialist, come what may, their response is, well, I'll be okay, I'm in my 40s. They look less indifferent when it's pointed out to them the average of those fighting on the front line in Ukraine is 43 years of age. When reports say that the average of those fighting in Ukraine is 43, you need to understand what this truly means. At the time of writing this book, those under 25 years of age were not yet given or being conscripted in Ukraine, which means that those dying in the oligarchy's war are aged between 26 and 65 years of age, with the average being 43. If you think that the shame of the entire Canadian Parliament giving 2 standing ovations praising the actions of a man who voluntarily joined Hitler's Waffen SS was enough to stop the oligarchy supporting the National Socialists in Ukraine, think again. At the end of May 2024, Oh, I know why I'm reading this wrong. It's because they haven't actually put in proper grammar in here. At the end of May 2024, a video was released of Boris Johnson, wannabe Churchillian, apparently praising the heroes of the Azov Battalion. In a meeting in the UK Parliament, UK MPs applaud Ukrainian neo-Nazis, with a photo showing that the Ukrainians were wearing the National Socialist insignia. The Azov Battalion were there in their military uniform with their infamous flag, with photos of Boris Johnson holding the flag emblazoned with the logo of the Svoboda Party, a logo shared with the American Aryan Nation. Anyone can look on Wikipedia and see the Svoboda Azov logo is the wolf's angel. You have to wonder if these Ukrainian heroes were told to hide any SS logos the way the Ukrainian National Socialist soldiers were told to do so in Canada, Germany, etc., etc. But then, since Britain's Free Press, who are obsessed with the mythical far right, see Appendix 10, deliberately deceived the public about the power of Ukraine's National Socialists, who knows what that insignia or tattoos Boris Johnson's heroes were sporting? With the exception of one commentator on GB News, Britain's Free Press was silent about Parliament inviting soldiers there holding aloft a neo-Nazi insignia whilst Britain's MPs fomented World War III. In contrast, just 1 month after the British news, media had a blackout on reporting that Boris Johnson and other MPs were praising Ukraine's neo-Nazis in Parliament, The Telegraph and The Independent, and they each had lengthy reports on Tommy Robinson being arrested in Canada over nothing, where he was released without charge. And I should know that because I think I covered it. Britain's MPs will praise actual foreign neo-Nazis, won't even speak to a British man who has publicly denounced National Socialism for 15 years. Reports in The Independent in 2022 discussed the Nazism of the Azov Battalion and their use of the SS Wolf Angel. But in 2024, the newspapers obsessed with the far right were suddenly silent when the same Azov Nazis were parading their flag and being praised in Parliament. the news media went to town exposing that Boris Johnson had a birthday party during the COVID lockdown. But the news media was silent when he praises National Socialists in Ukraine. Notice how during the riots of August 2024, I am not calling him sir, Keir the traitor Starmer was denouncing the far right. Yet as leader of the opposition, he voiced no opposition to Boris Johnson praising the Azov battalion inside the Houses of Treachery. Parliament. Or maybe I was right first time. Indeed, within 2 weeks of the 2024 general election, Keir the traitor Starmer was announcing his government's steadfast support for Ukraine. Britain is ruled by a single party pretending to be different parties, the party of the oligarchy. The politicians pretend to oppose each other. The news media pretends to hold the politicians to account. It's all puppet theatre to herd the farm animals where the oligarchy want them to be. The fascist state snarls warnings about the threat from the far right just to stop the public from seeing that the oligarchy have been implementing fascism for decades and decades. Why do the politicians of the West fund and praise National Socialists in Ukraine if they're opposed to fascism? Why do journalists and the state-funded anti-fascist organizations stay quiet when these Nazis are killing people in Ukraine and these National Socialists are praised by the governments of liberal democracies? Because it's all a game of smoke and mirrors. It's all designed to conceal the fascist state and herd the public with dog whistles about the far right. It's not just the British oligarchy. By the middle of 2024, the US government removed its 2014 ban of the Azov blockade in Ukraine from using US weapons. In response to the neo-Nazi ideology of the group's founders, the US had banned the regiment from using American weapons in 2014. The oligarchy is happy to denounce Islamic terrorism and the far right within the borders of their own country, whilst arming avowed National Socialists and jihadis abroad. Whilst Biden's government is shipping weapons to avowed National Socialists, the oligarchy claim Trump's praised the Third Reich. The oligarchy has no values, which is why there are no grounds for rational debate with the oligarchy or their mercenaries. All they care about is that the masses are to be kept dumb and misled, looking for the threat of snowball for all the causes of problems on Animal Farm. Boris Johnson is the man credited with scuppering the peace deal between Ukraine and Russia in April 2022. Recently, the documents of the peace negotiations in April 2022 between Ukraine and Russia were published by the New York Times. These documents had remained secret for over 2 years, yet in those secret documents, two of Russia's conditions were: 1. Ukraine had to stop discriminating against its own citizens who speak Russian, and 2. They had to stop erecting monuments glorifying neo-Nazis and World War II-era Nazi collaborators. Why would Russia have stipulated this in a secret document if there were not National Socialists being elevated to positions of national glory in Ukraine? From 2012 onwards, every year Russia put before the United Nations a resolution against the glorification of Nazism. Yet the EU states and the USA kept voting against this resolution, even though for a decade it was voted for by a majority of nations. Really, we shouldn't be surprised by the liberal democracies of the West refusing to denounce National Socialism, because they are planning for decades to use Ukrainian National Socialism against Russia in future. As discussed above, Britain and Canada imported vast numbers of Ukrainian SS officers in the years after World War II. And the top levels of the EU had been riddled with National Socialists and fascism since the end of World War II. Not surprisingly, since the planned socialist state was a project shared by communists, fascists and English Fabian socialists long before World War II. The oligarchy need the distraction of war with Russia to transition to greater anti-democratic repression that World War III will bring. Without this transition to increased serfdom, the masses in liberal democracies are going to realize we have been scammed by the oligarchy for the past century. We predicted over 10 years ago that a global pandemic, or again, maybe I was right first time, and World War III would come because the oligarchy need to distract the public from the implosion of the money bubble. The oligarchy need massive disruption, censorship and brainwashing as they move the world into the next stage of financial control. The serfdom of the COVID lockdown was a taste of what's to come with digital currency. As we mentioned above, in 1971, US Republican stroke number 4, President Nixon declared himself as a Keynesian Fabian socialist when Nixon temporarily ended the gold standard for it never to return. Nixon opened up the West to using communist China as a cheap global manufacturing hub in order to keep the costs of manufactured goods low, and thus reduce the perception of the inflation caused by the money bubble. However, in 1974, Nixon also created the petrodollar to ensure the USA another technique to keep the perception of skipped ahead. To ensure a continuous global demand for US dollars, thus providing the oligarchy in the USA another technique to keep the perception of inflation there low, because even off the gold standard, the petrodollar arrangement would mean a continued demand for the US dollar for payments of oil, with an agreement that countries such as Saudi Arabia would invest their dollars into US government bonds. Another of the signs that we are a major turning point in history, or at one I should say, is that the petrodollar is coming to an end. But there are no reports on this in the oligarchy news media. Another sign of this turning point is how historically neutral Switzerland sanctioned Russia, when even during World War II, Swiss banks continued to perform banking operations for Hitler's Germany. Another is that after 200 years of neutrality, Sweden has now abandoned that position. A further sign is the confiscation of $300 billion in Russian assets abroad. The oligarchy showing that the entire history of property rights means nothing to them. If the oligarchy can steal the wealth of the country with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, do you think the oligarchy have any respect for your property or your rights? In 2022, President Biden, with 49 years as a professional politician, said, if you want to resist your own government, you will need F-15 fighter jets and maybe nuclear weapons. The oligarchy are at war with the masses everywhere. It's just that certain tribes get bought off because they mistakenly think the oligarchy are on their side. When push comes to shove, you will see all their talk of human rights was just hot air. They do what they like. And now we move on to chapter 4.8. Digital currency equals social control. The final stage of the financial trap will be when the countries introduce central bank digital currencies. In this regard, the entire cryptocurrency phenomenon was probably designed by the oligarchy to accustom the masses to the idea that there is value in cryptocurrencies. But really, these are just the ultimate form of fiat currency and the ultimate form of social control. In liberal democracies, total serfdom is just a few years away. But what is a cryptocurrency? Fundamentally, they are complex numbers with a ledger, recording that Mr. X owns a specific complex number. He can sell his complex number to someone else. Anyone can simply copy the idea and create Shih Tzu coin, and start selling ownership of that complex number with the Shih Tzu coin system. That's why there are 23,000 different cryptocurrency systems. When a currency unit was made of the most precious metal, the creation of the coin cost about as much as the precious metal, plus the cost of energy, metal working skill, etc., etc. With paper currency, the actual note might say £50, but it costs only pennies to manufacture. With cryptocurrencies, the cost is even less than pennies. But these cryptocurrencies have no intrinsic value. It's not even as if they were, say, prime numbers, and once one is allocated to an owner, no one could ever perform a calculation without paying some fee to the owner of that prime number. Who first came up with the idea of cryptocurrencies? An institution of the oligarchy, America's National Security Agency, in 1996. Just over a decade later, Bitcoin was created by some shadowy man going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. When those Japanese words are translated in English, he's called Central Intelligence. That is cute. This man would be immensely rich, except he vanished and not cashed in his 1 million bitcoins. You can look up the value of these bitcoins, valued at approximately £53 billion, at the time of writing. Enough billions to make him one of the 25 richest billionaires in the world. It's astonishing that people are not more skeptical about Bitcoin in particular and cryptocurrency in general, given that the founder could be rich and famous but has instead vanished. Of course, if Bitcoin is a branch of the NSA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, then perhaps it's no surprise that the founder, worth 53 billion, is nowhere to be seen and isn't even spending this money. Bitcoin has been named and marketed to deceive. There is no coin. They are just trying to get the public to focus on that part of the elephant, something tangible that the public understand. We've met people who have put their entire life savings into cryptocurrencies without even understanding the basics of what these financial instruments are. Moreover, when the Bitcoin advocates gave a graphical representation of this coin, they show it as a gold coin. So they want the public to think a complex stroke number 5, a complex number stored on a computer network, is the equivalent of a physical object, which has been used as a store of value for 5,000 years. When the Bitcoin network eventually goes down, and it will go offline just because of the laws of physics, every year the energy requirements of the Bitcoin network doubles, and it already uses more electricity than than some countries. Pretty soon, the network will use more electricity than the entire UK. Furthermore, since the oligarchy oppose gold because its quantity is not under their control, the oligarchy would never allow an alternative money to exist that they did not control. These cryptocurrencies have served the purpose of the oligarchy. The public has been told that there's value in this. The ultimate valueless fiat currency. So virtually every country in the world is in the process of deploying its own central bank digital currency, CBDC. Once this is done, there will be no cash. Moreover, as with Bitcoin, etc., every time a unit of currency is transferred between Mr. X and Ms. Y, there will be a record of that transaction in the ledger. This means the oligarchy can add this transaction to their tracking of your internet usage. They know what sites you use, what your interests are, who you're connected to on your social networks. This is an addition to their auditory and visual surveillance of you. Your mobile phone is constantly listening to conversations and uploading transcribed conversations to the techno-fascists. Even when you have Siri or Hello Google switch to no listening, only communist China has more surveillance cameras than the UK. So-called cryptocurrency would enable the fascist state to track exactly where you've been, what you buy, and what you sell, who you are in connection with, in addition to knowing what you are talking about. It won't be a question of them needing to get a call to look up your credit card, etc., or your bank account, etc., etc. The central bank will contain all this information and your social credit score, but it gets worse than that. CBDCs will allow them to introduce programmable money. As you can see from the discussion from the Bank of England, linked in the note, the staid-old central banks are overtly talking about programmable money. That means money they can make do things. Currency units they can control. While your first thought that might be they'll use this to crush dissenters, that is obviously true. But it is much worse than that. And that will be today's session done. I'm doing a little shorter a period of reading as usual, or than usual, I should say, because I do want to try and tone it down just a little bit. So we just finished page 240. We'll be continuing off from 241. So those currencies that they talked about, actually, let me just bring this up one more time. Where is it? I will find it in here somewhere. Central bank, your social credit score. This is something that I have been discussing with my friend Mike for some time. Unfortunately, we are heading towards a situation where we will have social credit score. That's inevitable. That's the cold, bitter truth. We're going to head to a situation where the only thing that will be different about us compared to China is the country name. That's it. They surveil us through cameras. They surveil us through phones. They surveil us through all manners of different shit that they have on us. And what do you think going fully digital is going to do? Cashless society. Think about it. They'll be able to track every single thing we do. Everything we buy. Every site we visit, as it said. Every single thing we try to do, they'll know about it. And the thing about going cashless is it means that you basically won't be able to do anything without the government knowing about it. Scary, isn't it? Scary to think that that could be the case. Now, there are some counter-arguments to it as well, and I actually have one of them, which is pay as you go. So, in order to be able to basically use your gas card or your electric stick or whatever you use to stick in the meter, what happens if we're no longer able to use cash for that? What happens when we have to basically think of other ways to get that stuff on? Now, maybe they will allow us to use our cards on that. I don't know. But what I do know, I actually have the stick here. I almost forgot I placed it here. But what happens if you can't just use this stick and give someone stick and give someone cash to get energy on this stick? Scary, isn't it? Could leave people helpless. Maybe that's why British Gas wanted people to get on the smart meters. And we all know how much of a con those smart meters are. You know, the fact that they basically have every opportunity to survey where the high points are in your energy usage, and then they can hike your prices up at those high points, so you have to pay a metric shit ton more. So, that's what we got to look forward to, folks. It's a scary proposition. But thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.